Welcome to Agile Coaches Corner by AgileThought, the podcast for practitioners and leaders seeking advice to refine the way they work and pave the path to better outcomes. Now, here's your host, coach, and Agile expert, Dan Neumann.
Welcome to this episode of Agile Coaches Corner. I'm your host, Dan Neumann. Our goal here is to bring you Agile topics in an approachable way. If you have a topic you'd like to hear discussed, you can email it to us at podcast@agilethought.com, or you can tweet it to us with the hashtag AgileThoughtPodcast. I'm excited today to have a colleague of mine, Mike Cooper, who has an extensive background in negotiation. That's not his particular focus for a lot of what he does at AgileThought right now, but he has an experience with restructuring a whole bunch of bank deals and brokerages, negotiating property sales under the guidance of a Wall Street trader and banker, and managing a bunch of sales folks. And so it's also interesting that we're coming out of this shortly after the government shut down, and this is not a political podcast, but it's interesting that at least supposedly it was a breakdown in negotiation that got us there. So Michael, welcome, and I'm curious what your thoughts are.
Glad to be here. Well, I wonder whether or not that political situation is actually more political posturing than it is my definition of what negotiating is.
How do you view that? Yeah,
because I don't necessarily think that most of the people in politics are following the principles of ethical negotiations. They're more interested in making political points. And so there are two different games going on right there.
Yeah. So how do you, when you use the term ethical negotiation, what's the nuance behind that then that differs from, let's say, a political type of negotiating to win?
Okay. Well, ethical negotiating is one form of negotiating, and it's the one that I recommend and actually teach within our organization. It's based upon the concept that if we're going to do a deal, it's going to be a win-win deal, or there's going to be no deal at all. It's oriented around long-term relationship building, and it's structured around the concept of mutual problem solving. And that's the way I really see negotiating. Negotiating is a process and a series of methods and techniques to solve problems when there's a conflict. So if you take this sort of approach, then it's actually fun and you can be very creative. And the net is you really want to achieve a long-term, strong, trusting relationship with the other party. And that's when it's most important. If you're doing a quick car deal or something like that, where you really don't care about the guy next time, you don't need to use the ethical negotiating strategies. You can use different techniques. But when you're in relationships like we are in consulting, the long-term client relationship is critical. And so there's certain foundations that we need to follow.
Yeah, I know what you described in the car dealership would be things like, how do we get leverage? How do we win in that? And so what are some of those foundational elements to ethical negotiation that you'd mentioned a couple of them? Hey, we're in a relationship for the long term. We're trying to establish a win-win foundation. So those seem like mental foundations for the rest of the negotiation.
Yeah, part of the methodology that I like to follow is centered around a book written, I think, about 30 years ago or more, called "Getting to Yes" by Urey and Fisher. It's developed out of the negotiating labs at MIT, and they've developed a series of approaches that help one develop that long-term relationship. And you can imagine the thing you really want to start with is focusing on the people, not the problem. So I don't know how many people I've seen in negotiations. They want to sort of get right to the point. They want to go right to the issues at hand, and they don't want to spend a lot of time actually understanding who they're dealing with, what's driving this person, what their background is. And so a slow approach and understanding that at the end of the day we're all people helps us develop a relationship where. Because essentially what you want to do at some point is you want to sit on the same side of the table as your quote adversary. You want to actually be on their side, helping them look at the problem and say, hey, together we will solve this problem. That's one of the issues.
And that what you described as a mental model of being on the same side of the table, I've actually seen work really well when I work with agile teams and we have a problem to solve. We physically, let's get up and go to the whiteboard, put the problem up there. So now we have two people trying to solve a problem and we're looking at the whiteboard. We're not squared off against each other and physically opposed to each other.
Yeah, and in fact, a technique that you've used in sessions, I'm sure, is you have typically an icebreaker, and that icebreaker is really oriented around getting you to learn a little bit about the other people, telling a funny story about yourself, telling a bit about your background. In negotiating, obviously, you're going to walk into a room sometime when you got people sitting on one side, people sitting on the other side. You don't know who they are, you don't know what their agendas are. A technique, if again you need that long-term relationship, is to slow down. And spend time talking and understanding the people, and certainly when you get into the heat of terms or issues that you want to that might be driving you emotionally, you need to be aware that in fact you're dealing with other people, and that you really want to separate the people from the problem. That's a critical thing in good ethical negotiating is making sure that you separate out what's driving them from the issues at hand.
And as you say that, now's a good time to remind folks that we'll put the show notes up on agilethought.com/podcast. And so as Michael, you and I are talking through some of these scenarios, we'll turn those into more of a bulleted list that people can have available. So slowing down, spending some time getting to know people with that you're going to be problem solving together with is super important.
Yeah.
So sometimes I feel like we get stuck with the time pressure. We have to, do this now, or we have 30 minutes, let's sit down. And so removing that time pressure seems like a key to what you're describing.
Yeah, and realizing that if you're in it for the long run, this solution or the problem that we're dealing with today is going to be one of a long series of issues that we're going to deal with. This conflict we're here in today won't be the last conflict we have. So thinking of things in the long term, and putting the people ahead of the problem really sets you up for a long-term trusting relationship. But what it also then gets to is the second point is that if you are rushed, you tend to skip the concept of generating a lot of options. And what I encourage people to do all the time is, okay, what's the next option? No, we don't have any time. We just got to do this. We got to do this. The push, say that, here's the answer. Usually the first notion out of the gate is not necessarily the best one. In fact, it rarely is the best one. It's the one that has had the least creativity thrown into it, the least discussion, the least debate, the least vetting. And so a critical step to take in good ethical negotiating is to generate a lot of options. And for people in the technical and the agile world and the problem solving world, this actually is where you get to be creative, because it's that time in the relationship. You remember what we've done is we've got a conflict. I focus more on the person and getting to understand them, really getting behind, what's driving them. And now they've agreed to let me sit on the same table. And I say, hey, look, what we have is my way or the doorway, or your way or the doorway. What other options can we come up with? And as you said, we can get up on the whiteboard, we can start generating more ideas. And the more we can come up with, the more ideas that we have and of course, what I've done as well is I've spent time understanding what's driving them. You say you need these 10 new features added and delivered within 1 week. What's behind that? What's behind that? Have you got a competitive pressure that you're dealing with? Have you got a boss that's suddenly coming down on you for whatever reason? Once we understand the true problem, then we can actually generate more options, and we have more degrees of freedom, as the problem solvers call it. And therefore, we have more ways that we can solve the problem than we imagined, an hour beforehand. So it's really, as I say, people tend to freeze under conflict, and creativity goes down. And so if we focus on the people and we say, hey, we're here to get creative, you can actually open the gateways of creativity and generate a lot of different options, and options that are typically much, much better than the original positions that people might have taken.
What you were describing there, Mike, with generating a lot of options reminded me of the book Crucial Conversations, where what characterizes those is high stakes, opinions differ, and emotions are really involved. And so that author describes it as a fool's choice when you have just the two options and it's either option A or option B. And so putting a framework in place to generate a lot of options, or at least a third option or a fourth option, really adds value.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's hard for one party or the other not to feel that they're on the lose end of a win-lose agreement. If in fact I came in and said, and at the end of the day, we chose one of the options, my way or your way. Many people in technology business see their role as to serve, and so what they do is they avoid the conflict, and when faced with an aggressive client who's demanding, they see the way to avoid the conflict is simply to cave in and agree. Well, I have a hard time stretching to label that as negotiating, but in fact it is. It's just a bad negotiation. One of the lines from Urey and Fisher book is, whether or not you think you're negotiating, you are. And so it's important for to not run for that corner of the client really wants that. Oh, I'm here to serve them. Yes, you can't feel like a winner, and if you haven't put your issues on the table, if you haven't said this is what's important to me, and the client will never know. And so, what are you training the client to do? What are you telling the client? You're saying to the client in that case, in this scenario, yeah, go ahead and step on me. Go ahead and push me around. So if they're saying, hey, I want 40 points of stories in the next sprint, and you think your capacity is 30, and you agree to it, you cave, they're thinking, what are they thinking next time? They're thinking 45. This does not build a long-term good relationship, because now you're pushing your people really hard. You're producing product that maybe isn't the quality because you have to skip something, and you're just going to take out the quality steps. So not failing to negotiate is a very, very bad choice. Failing to generate a single option is a very, very bad choice. And the net of it all is it doesn't lead to a good long-term relationship.
I like what you described. People oftentimes want to serve, and you're not serving your customer, your partner, if you don't share the ideas that you have, if you don't bring your expertise and your skill and your passion and thoughts to the problem that purportedly you're supposed to be trying to solve together. So that's not service. That's a very dysfunctional relationship.
Exactly. It's very, very dysfunctional. And at the end of the day, those engagements that you have, if you're in a consulting business like we are, those engagements will finally decay and decline. There's no way that you can maintain a good relationship if you've agreed from the get-go not to make it win-win. If you said, I'm going to lose so the client will win. Well, at the end of the day, the client doesn't get the best from your people. You haven't put additional options on the table. You haven't said, hey, here are things that matter to me. And so you're going to cut corners. You're going to do something that doesn't work overall, and you're not going to produce what that client wants. And it's not going to lead to a good, long-term, solid relationship. At the end of the day, you require a certain degree of courage, so that when the client comes in and is maybe initially aggressive with you, which is not ethical negotiating, by the way, that you have the courage to push back and say, hey, look, I understand where you're coming from. Let's spend a little more time understanding what's motivating and what's behind what you're doing. But at the same time, here are the issues that I have to put on the table that are important to me. And if they don't know that and you haven't put that on the table, then you're not being fair to the client and to your own team as well. So being able to have that courage and the skills will, at the end of the day, lead to your goal, which is win-win relationships that are strong in the long term. It's true collaboration.
You'd alluded to freezing under pressure. And I know personally I've experienced that, where for some reason, the adrenaline's kind of going. Maybe it is a car negotiation. Maybe it's some kind of heated, timely conversation where you actually do want a relationship, but you leave and then you think, oh, I wish I would have shared this. I wish I would have thought of that. Yeah. And so are there some ways to help alleviate that time pressure or lower the conflict so that freezing is less likely?
Well, you raise a good point, is that if I'm following a less ethical negotiating strategy, I do want the other side to freeze. and I do, because I basically do want to push the other side around, and I do want to eliminate their ability to react to the actions that I'm taking. So I think you just answered your own question, though, is that if you feel that you are getting into a time, you're freezing, take a moment, take time, reschedule it, breathe in, breathe out. There's nothing that, if you feel you aren't being creative, you aren't producing the options, then ask for permission, negotiate a break, and say, look, I think it's in our best interest if we take a break here for an hour. I've got to get some air, talk to some people, collect my thoughts, and let's come back and begin to solve the problem again. At the end of the day, though, you may face a scenario where the other party is really not willing to engage in the proposed relationship, not willing to engage in what I'm terming as an ethical negotiating approach. It doesn't really care whether or not we have a win-win arrangement. Their perspective might be, I'm just here to drive your price as low as possible into the ground, and I'm just here to squeeze you in any way I can. We are going to hit those type of situations, and so what we need to develop in that case is our, as Urian Fisher called it, our BATNA, or our best alternative to not agreeing. In other words, where are we going to? What can we put on the table should we not be able to get an agreement? What alternative is going to be good for us and probably good for the other side, but it's suboptimal for us. But it's something that we'd be willing to live with. Clearly, one of the alternatives to not agreeing is simply to walk away, simply to say, I don't think there's a win in the relationship here for both of us, and we'd be better to part company. That's the worst case scenario, because that's not meeting your goal of developing a long-term relationship that day. But on the other hand, under reflection, if this person is as they think about it, maybe they'll come back and say, maybe I was unfair to you, or I didn't listen to what your requirements were, and I know the quality of your people and your work, and I'm willing to come back to the table and talk again. So there's nothing wrong with walking away if you've exhausted and you've demonstrated who you are, you've demonstrated your approach, you've just demonstrated your commitment to listening to them, to generating options, to separating the people from the problem, and to be a good long-term partner. You demonstrate that, and you have alternatives that you think you can live with if you can't get that. But I don't think there's anything with walking away if in fact you can't get, you've exhausted everything.
Have a topic you want us to tackle? Send an email to podcast@agilethought.com or tweet it with the hashtag AgileThoughtPodcast.
Yeah, what you were referring to there reminds me of a scenario I ran into when I was looking prior to AgileThought to hang my own shingle out as an Agile consultant. So I was at a company and I was exploring going independent, and I had somebody who was I don't want to say he was unethical, but the approach he was taking could appear to be unethical. And it was a bargain basement price for Agile coaching, which it was just crazy. It was so far out of line with what the market was. It was crazy. And I was like, well, I don't think this is going to work for us. So thank you. And we'll part ways. And gosh, not a month later, he called about 11 o'clock on a Friday night and said, oh, geez, I had this person placed in the role and they backed out because they got, another better offer. And I was like, well, yeah. I mean, that's why we didn't do this deal in the first place. And so it kind of reset the negotiation, because he was like, are you still interested? And the answer was yes, but not under the guidelines you were talking about. So walking away doesn't necessarily mean we're never going to talk. It just means it's a bogus deal for now. We're not set up to win-win, and who knows, maybe that pendulum will swing back in the future and there will be a better chance to set up a relationship.
Yeah. You've shown your colors, right? You in that case, you showed your colors. You said, here's who I am, and it's an honorable person who's willing to help you. And I can't think of a better shingle to make sure that people see, even if they don't do a deal with you that day, because eventually if they need that sort of relationship, they know where to go. Now, I want to just make a point that, as you were saying, it's ethical, or what's the opposite of it? It's not unethical negotiating. The historical negotiating strategies and tactics, and I've taken courses on them, are typically called positional negotiating. In other words, I'm going to take my position. You're going to take yours. We're going to dig long trenches, and we're going to have trench warfare against each other. And I'm going to try, and I'm going to have all these techniques to make you feel. Remember the books from back in the 60s and 70s, ignorant, anxious, or guilty. I'm going to try and emotionally manipulate you so that you feel small, so that you cave into my needs. That is, and there are two types of positional negotiating. There's the hardball negotiating, which you're just describing, and there's the cave. And of course, if you can get the perfect marriage, somebody who's a very aggressive pusher and somebody who just caves all the time, positional negotiators, they do deals. It isn't necessarily a good deal for either party in the long run. It certainly doesn't bring any creativity on the table, didn't put a lot of options. They're not collaborating on problem solving. You just have somebody coming in, dropping in an order, and the other side saying, yes, sir, whatever you want, sir. And so it's suboptimal. And in the case, in the world of like we are in consulting, we are professional problem solvers. And so why don't we apply our professional problem solving to areas where we have conflicts? And that's really what I've been trying to promote throughout our organization with this approach.
What you referred to also brought to mind kind of levels of conflict. And one of the base levels of conflict is we just have a problem to solve together. It's not physical, safety is in danger, or, we don't want to work with each other, but that we have a problem to solve type of conflict, and keeping that really creative and making sure both sides get their needs met is important.
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, think about what I was saying about training the client, right? Or training not the client, but the other party in the negotiation, in the relationship. Whenever you have conflict, if on an ongoing basis in that relationship, you have demonstrated a strong, ethical, non-positional approach to solving the problem. You put a lot of options on the table. You care deeply about them, and you separate them from the problem. And you're constantly coming up with you're putting your issues on the table, and you're constantly coming up with good solutions. Over time, just think what that does when this is what you're doing every week, and it's month after month after month after month. You have a very collaborative relationship and a very strong relationship. And I would say that the comment that I've gotten from clients is, in the middle of a testy discussion where I'm saying, no, this is that option you have on the table is not one that's good for any of us. I don't like it. Here's the reason why. They'll just look at me and they say, it says, if that's the way you feel, I'll have to trust you, because I do trust you, because I know you're always looking out for our interests. So once you have that point across, then you become truly a good, trusted advisor. You have a strong relationship that where they are, where they've now realized that you are not trying to pull one on them. You're not trying to, do anything that's incorrect or unethical. That in fact you are always looking out for their best interests, and you're applying your skills in a technique to generate a lot of really good solutions for them. I think it's a very, very enjoyable way of working with people.
It is. And I want to go back to a lot of times as an Agile coach, we find ourselves in a role of actually training the client. So we are training the client. Often it might be like the product owner with the development team, or the product owner with their stakeholders. And we actually find ourselves in a facilitative role of trying to build the skills of the people that are participating in these negotiations, because sometimes they come to the table with the win-lose, or my way or the highway. And we're trying to help really build an understanding. There are so many other ways to generate more outcomes.
Yeah, maybe we should be collaborating on building expanding your educational curriculum there, so that we can talk about typical conflicts that would occur between various players in an agile project. There's always a certain type of conflict between the product owners and the technical team. There's always a certain we know what they are, having been in this business for so long, and and we can help both sides actually approach that not as a point of pain, but a point of creativity and a point of joy, actually, where you actually say, hey, it's opening my eyes and I'm beginning to realize things I never had thought about before, because I'm not looking this as my way, or as you say, my way or the highway.
Absolutely. So, yes, and I totally agree. Continuing to build those skills is super valuable. How do you know if you're being successful? Do you have a metric in mind for knowing the degree to which the relationship is positive?
If you never plan a negotiation, you'll have no goals, right? So many people who negotiate, they show up for the negotiation, and I remember I've been in meetings many times where I turn to one of our people who's doing the negotiation that day, our chief negotiator, and I'll say, "What are our objectives today?" And they say, "Oh, I don't know." And I can guarantee you. And so I think you mentioned some of my background where I was negotiating. I had taken an entire organization's entire book of contracts. We renegotiated every single one of them on a new approach. This is because technology had moved and we were charging based upon machines, and we needed to charge based upon client value. And what we had done in that scenario is I had a whiteboard there, and everybody knew my approach, and each sales guy would come in to talk about an account that afternoon, and we would write down a plan. We picked, probably 6 different factors that were important to that client and us. And we started talking about the opening offers that we would make. We talk about what our BATNA was, what we would walk away from, and strategies for moving from one place to another within the negotiation. So I can tell you that how did I measure that? Well, did I negotiate all the contracts? Yes. Did we increase our revenues at the same time? Yes. Were the clients happy? Yes. That's the way I measured. If it was a win-win for everybody, and you're able to get the agreements completed, that to me was very positive. But had I not planned them, then I wouldn't have had a scorecard. And so it's after we do our initial little course internally, negotiating here, it's the one thing I leave everybody with is now go ahead and plan your next negotiating session. Go in with some options so you don't have to force yourself in 20 minutes or 30 minutes to come up with various options. Spend some time out front figuring out what the options are. Maybe do some homework initially, finding out more about the people, or spend some time with them to understand more about them. So I think to me the bottom line is the relationship strong? Is it win-win in the long run? Is it profitable for both parties?
Outstanding. Those are some good tips. Is there anything else you want to make sure people kind of take away about this concept of ethical negotiation?
Well, when you go to people in the technology side, they often associate negotiating with selling, and therefore that's why many of them fall into the pattern of just being servants and just saying, well, we're just here to serve the client. Whatever they want is okay. But negotiating is actually a creative problem-solving approach. And there's an ethical way to do it, the one that where you're focusing on the win-win for both parties. So I would strongly encourage everybody who's in the consulting business, everybody who's in the technology business, even if you're in internal technology, you'll actually solve more problems for your firm if you take a interested and aggressive approach to being a creative problem solver, aka ethical negotiating.
That's outstanding. And yes, thank you for differentiating the negotiation and problem solving from selling. Because I think a lot of times, if you can help somebody solve the problem, the selling becomes the easy part because you've demonstrated concern and care and there's value. And then it's just a matter of some paperwork after that.
Exactly.
Mike, one of the things we have at the end of the podcast is just an opportunity to explore what are you reading these days, whether it's a blog or a book, and maybe some of the value you're receiving from that.
Currently reading a couple of books on my Kindle. One of them is The Laws of Human Nature by Robert Greene. Very interesting that he places our begins to help us understand that our cognitive abilities, which we're using in this type of negotiation, are layered on top of millions of years of evolution on top of very emotional animals. And so part of the approach, and it helped me sort of understand that part of the approach of actually understanding the people and getting to know them and remaining very positive and solution oriented, is to make sure that you don't accidentally trigger the animal within on the other side and turn them into a raging beast again, as opposed to a modern cognitive person. So it's actually very supportive in the thinking that I've learned through the negotiating background.
Well, and you touch on something interesting, and we're not cognitive creatures. I mean, we are emotional creatures. Millions of years have helped humans get to the point where, those emotions can serve us well, right? The fight or flight. If it's a tiger chasing you in the bushes, right? Run. But though that emotion gets in the way of what could be rational, clear thinking. And of course, there's all the cognitive biases of when we think we're rational, but we're actually not. Totally separate subject. But yeah, you
don't want the other party in a negotiation just to close down. And as I was saying in the positional negotiating, when you're at war, you're not really into the sort of a cerebral problem solving approach. Your idea is to kill the other side, and then you get into a positional negotiating. That's your view. You say, I'm here to win. I don't care what the other side is. So you want to avoid that if you can. And I guess in a way I'd sort of pose the ethical negotiating as a higher form of negotiating over the old, centuries-long positional negotiating.
Well, thank you for adding Laws of Human Nature to my personal reading backlog. Well, thank you, Mike, for sharing on the topic of ethical negotiation today, as well as the book Laws of Human Nature. And we'll be sure to put the tips and the many good suggestions you had into the show notes, and people can go find those on the AgileThought.com/podcast website. Thank you, Mike.
Thank you. Been a pleasure.
This has been the Agile Coaches Corner podcast, brought to you by AgileThought. Get the show notes and other helpful tips from this episode and other episodes at AgileThought.com/podcast.